welcome to Alternative Forms of Diplomacy, Espionage, and Assassination, which sounds like a very exciting topic for today. This talk is brought to you by the Departments of History and Political Science, as well as the Department of English. And we have a wonderful panel with us. Starting on the far end right now, Lachlan Whalen, who is the Director of International Studies and an Associate Professor of English and Linguistics. Next to him is Ann Livshiz, an Associate Professor of History. And next to her, an Assistant Professor, Deborah Bauer from the Department of History as well. My name is Andy Downs. I'm from the Department of Political Science. We are happy to have this conversation in the basement of the library at Helmke Library on the IPFW campus, and we want to thank College Television for recording it and making it available, and of course we want to thank WBOI for making it available as well. We don't want to waste any time, get right into it, and so let's start. What is espionage? Deborah?
Well, espionage is one of these things that is hard to define. Almost all history books that you read about espionage start out with a bunch of paragraphs giving caveats about this is a complicated practice. And normally it gets couched within a larger system that we call intelligence. So, right, I teach a history of espionage class. Espionage is kind of the exciting title, but really we're talking about intelligence as a system. So with a definition of intelligence, there are a few things that are important to factor in. One of those is the element of secrecy. So it's information, knowledge, foreknowledge, something that you can acquire about perhaps your enemies, perhaps your friends, but the fact that this is secret knowledge makes it different from other kinds of knowledge. Another way to think about intelligence is sort of the process by which it's collected and analyzed, and this is where espionage fits in through that process. And then finally we have the institution and the analysis of intelligence. So sometimes you say the word intelligence and you're thinking of an intelligence agency. So I know that was a broad definition, and then to kind of get into the narrow what is espionage within that larger umbrella, I would succinctly call espionage the practice of covertly or secretly gathering information that will be used for the purpose of understanding or influencing foreign enemies.
I have been asking Deborah what her class is like, and she refuses to tell me, actually. She tells me I should have to take the class as a covert person trying to get intelligence about the class. Either of you have anything you want to add to that definition? Lachlan?
I think that's an excellent overview of it. I would maybe add as well to the general category of intelligence, certainly in a case like Northern Ireland, part of what is definitely part of the intent is the conditioning of public opinion through that, and maybe that's the sort of application of all of the intelligence, but in terms of what is done with that is also an essential part of it, the conditioning of public opinion.
Right, we don't just gather it to gather it, there's a purpose to gathering it, sure.
Right, that's why influence within that definition I think is important.
Ann?
And I mean, one of the perhaps the paradoxes of it is that on the one hand, there's obviously a very strong element of secrecy, but we also see, especially in the 20th century, there is a public element to it as well, right? Kind of this, as the practices of espionage get more and more complex, there's also a greater publicity associated with not the specific details, but the practice overall. Especially during war, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, we see a lot of public campaigns by pretty much all the participating government that emphasize the importance of not talking publicly about things you shouldn't be talking about, right? This idea that, walls have ears, that somebody's possibly listening, possibly watching, in kind of in this very general sense. And it's interesting that even though the espionage is performed by kind of these highly trained professionals, there's a way in which the 20th century, kind of the mass century, right? There's this mass participation. You too can participate, right, by not talking about things you shouldn't be talking about, by displaying vigilance, vigilance of some sort. So there's this kind of weird, interesting participatory element to it, alongside the highly professionalized and very secret, of course, practice.
And we'll eventually have some posters that we'll talk about and show folks that get at that public element. Deborah, what would you say is the earliest example of espionage?
Okay, so the earliest often people throw out the kind of prototype of the spies in the Bible is one of the earliest. This is not the earliest. This is by far not the earliest. The story of the spies in the Bible is Moses sending 12 spies out to spy the land of Canaan. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I will leave that on the table. But the earliest kind of actual documented example of using intelligence, using espionage as a military tactic comes in ancient China. And you may be familiar with the name Sun Tzu, who wrote a treatise called The Art of War. He was a general, he was a military strategist, and he writes this, this treatise called The Art of War, which is very much an advice manual about waging warfare for the emperor who he's serving underneath. And in this treatise, he talks about war as, he refers to it as a life and death matter, that it is really the most important thing for a state. And the Art of War has several chapters, one of which is dedicated particularly to spies. And it's a short chapter. When we read it in my class, it's really only about 2 pages. But he describes war as very costly, both in terms of finances and in terms of human life. And so he says the smart leader, the smart emperor, will find a way to reduce the expenses. And spying is really the best way to do that. That if you can have knowledge, if you can have foreknowledge of your enemies, you can save the cost of the lives of your people, the cost of the state coffers. And so he lays out these 5 different types of spies, and there's the local spies, there's a category he calls moles, which are kind of traitors, really, enemy spies. There's the double agents. He considers double agents the most important spies, so if you can capture an enemy spy and turn them. He has a category called doomed spy, which I think modern agencies don't like to actually hire someone as the doomed spy, even though they probably use that. And that's where you send an agent out into the enemy camp to spread misinformation, and you count on them being caught and doomed. And then there's the surviving spies, which is similar to the doomed spies, who goes out and gets caught, only actually, or doesn't get caught, comes back from the enemy camp. So this treatise comes out in about 500 BC, and I would say it's really a great example of a manual explaining why intelligence is useful, why espionage is useful, how it can serve the state, and how it can really give you a tactical advantage in any kind of war or battle that you're going to get into.
Now we do have, I put this up here a little early, but there is an image that, that actually is an example, an early example of invisible ink. This particular item is, can you describe this for us?
So this comes from the American Revolution. And again, when I teach my history of espionage class, I'd like to start with this document by Sun Tzu, because like I say, I think it's really interesting to see in 500 BC people thinking of something that, as Anne mentioned, we think of as a very modern tactic. So it goes to show it's not. But in terms of espionage being used through history, it really doesn't get used a lot until the quote-unquote modern era. We have Elizabethan era, where Queen Elizabeth has somebody who serves as her spy master. And then we fast forward really to the American Revolution, at least in my class. And so, one of the things I was thinking about when I was putting this talk together is the techniques and the methods that were used to spy and how those have changed over time. And so I had sent Andy some images of techniques that were used during the American Revolution. And so this is one of them. And what we see here is a letter that was, written that any soldier might be carrying along with him. Perhaps it's a letter home to his parents, his wife, whatever. But between the lines of this ordinary letter is a secret message written in some kind of invisible ink. And generally there were 2 ways that you could get the secret message out from this letter, either through heat or through some kind of acidic reagent. And usually they would, during the American Revolution, you might put a little, either an F or an A somewhere in the corner of it, so that apply fire or apply acid.
Don't want to mix that up.
You don't want to do, so if it's fire, you would hold it over a candle. If it's acid, you use that, and that way you can get the secret message out of it. So this is one, and I don't know if you.
Well, we'll show some more later on. Since I put this one up here, just to sort of bring us from Sun Tzu up to the Revolutionary War. We'll get to some others later on.
Okay.
Is there a time period, though, Lachlan and Anne, is there a time period that you think about when you hear the term espionage?
Well, certainly my own period of study is the contemporary Northern Ireland, and so that's probably obviously the first thing that comes to my mind. And a very different world that when most people think of espionage, it's James Bond and martinis, and going to Monte Carlo. It's the diametric opposite in Northern Ireland. That when talking about intelligence assassination, it's the sort of seediest of the seedy in Northern Ireland, to the point where, for example, intelligence agencies are running double agents through places like the Kincora Boys Home, where pedophiles are being filmed in order to influence them and to control them. We're talking about massage parlors gathering information. We're talking sort of the seediest of the seedy, in addition to the other forms of intelligence that we're talking about here. So, but that's part and parcel of the way in which Northern Ireland was approached. That when the Troubles ignited, the person put in control of it initially was Frank Kitson, who was known for his counterinsurgency work in places like Kenya and Cyprus. And so very sort of brutal counterinsurgency methods. He published a book in 1960 called Gangs and Counter-Gangs. That gives you an idea of the sort of level that we're talking about here. And that became policy from almost the very beginning in the reignition of the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
And I think for a lot of people, when we say the Troubles, they don't necessarily realize how recently we're talking.
Right. So beginning in, you can trace them back as far as you want to 800 years or more, but when we say the Troubles, basically the sort of reignition starting in 1968 and proceeding in earnest from there until in 1998 you had the Good Friday / Belfast Agreement creating frameworks. 2005, you had the decommissioning of arms by the Irish Republican Army, and then a year or so afterwards by the Loyalist / pro-British paramilitary groups. So that's when we say the Troubles, that's generally what we mean there, from 68 to present, really, because we're still having issues that the Good Friday Agreement has not been fully implemented 20 years on. So.
Well, Anne, you're not exactly right in the middle there of the time periods of revolution and earlier as well as the modern day, but what time period do you think about when you hear the term?
Well, I think I want to mention both the 19th and 20th century. I think to go back to Deborah's earlier point, if you look at the history of Russia and espionage in Russia, there are some earlier examples, but it really comes into its own in the 19th century. That's where you start to see it actually be professionalized and as part of the government. And it's in the 19th century that the state actually develops the secret police to monitor the various discontents within the Russian Empire. But many of them end up having to leave Russia and spend time in Europe to escape arrest. And so as a result, the investigation of Russian discontents kind of spills over into Europe and becomes an international endeavor as well. And of course, and the secret police is kind of the Russian, the pre-1917 secret police is usually depicted as kind of a very technically they're professionals, but that they're not particularly good at their jobs. Perhaps not ruthless enough, not brutal enough. The 20th century kind of raises the bar on that quite a bit. But essentially, they are the ones who missed, the Bolsheviks. From the point of view of allowing these discontents to overthrow the regime, they failed pretty miserably. Whereas in the 20th century, there's just really interesting. There's some continuity. Some of the people who were agents end up continuing to work for now the secret police of the Bolsheviks. There's a very famous destruction of secret police document, quote, spontaneous attack on the building that held all the secret police records. And that was one of the archives that was destroyed very, very quickly. And spontaneously. And so as a result, it's the continuity, there's not we still don't know for sure about a lot of the continuities, but the espionage, the Soviet espionage really comes into it starts before World War II, but it really comes into its own during the Cold War period. And of course, most famously in the area of, nuclear, information about nuclear weapons. And of course, the Soviet kind of efforts at espionage abroad, especially in the United States, its main rival during the Cold War. I mean, you'll have to kind of put an asterisk next to it in a sense, right? Because there is a certain challenge to spying in a democratic society, right? I mean, the kinds of things that an American would have to, if an American wanted to spy in the Soviet Union, they really would have to kind of ferret out various information about society and culture, whereas in a democratic society, a lot of the things are fairly open. So they can claim successes. Oh, we learned that, that there's racial discrimination in America. Well, how did you learn about it? Well, it was in the New York Times. But, so you can claim credit for these discoveries, but ultimately, in some areas, it's not that much of a challenge, right? Whereas, of course, there's various state secrets involving nuclear weapons. That was more of a challenge, and certainly kind of a fairly successful one for the Soviet regime.
I know it's not necessarily a justification, but everybody does it. So does that make it right? I mean, Deborah's already made the case from a very historical standpoint that it's a good thing to do. It's economical. You gather intelligence. Is it the right thing to do? Does everyone do it? And is it the right thing to do?
I think those are two different questions. I think, right and wrong is war right? I don't think war is right. I don't think death is ever right, but it happens. It's a reality of human history, of the human future, the human present. And given that reality, I think, yes, espionage, yes, intelligence does have a place. I mean, you can go back to Machiavelli and the platitude of the ends justify the means. And if your ends are advancing your own state, your own nation, your own society, then all means are up for it. So is it right? Again, I think, in a lot of ways, espionage and intelligence really fit into the rubric of warfare. And there's a lot of stuff about war that, no, is not right. But because people do it, because this is humanity, I think it can get the nod, I guess.
And is it acceptable behavior?
Sure. I mean, it really does seem to be kind of a natural part of the competition. I mean, careful about the use natural, but it has evolved into a natural kind of aspect of the competition between international rivals. I mean, as far as kind of the kinds of things, again, to echo Deborah's point, of all the different things that are being done, spying is is not necessarily going to be the thing that is most horrific or terrible, especially since if done right, it does have the potential to save the lives of your people. Now, it may mean the destruction of lives of your opponents, but that's somebody else's problem, right?
Lachlan?
It's a tough one because, again, the difference between theory and practice, that in theory, the idea of saving lives is a good thing, but in practice, especially in a place like Northern Ireland is the sort of test case of a security state run amok in many respects. And so when you look at when a place where there's the sort of implicit caveat that there's going to be no repercussions to any of the intelligence agencies for assassination or anything else, and you look at the abuses that take place within that framework, it's hard to sort of justify that the ends justify the means, especially if the stated rationale is that we're saving you from terrorists, when you in fact are rolling up and shooting Chicago gangster style, accidentally a fruit vendor that you thought was an IRA member, like happened in 1972 to a couple of people in Upper Belfast. So it's, I don't know. It's those of you who have taken the poli-sci class or Intro to International Studies, the realist theory of, morality is a separate thing out of it. And so, I don't know.
Deborah, when you gave your definition earlier, you talked about the process for gathering information. We've already seen one example. You brought along examples of a few other things, so if we can talk a little bit more about some of the examples you brought of what I would call equipment or process.
Okay, so yeah, this was, we kind of got thrown off by Andy excitedly showing you the invisible ink beforehand, but this was in
I was very
response.
excited about the invisible ink.
It was pretty exciting.
Yes.
You know, the question of the equipment, the practices, and you know, I do like one of the earliest examples of gathering intelligence is from, you know, back thousands of years ago. If you could see smoke rising in the distance, then you would know an army is approaching based on, you know, the speed of their horses and the number of their horses. So that was early methods, and certainly until we get to the 19th, 20th century, equipment methodology for spying for intelligence doesn't advance too much. So the American Revolution is a really kind of neat era when we see humans putting their creativity to use. So the invisible ink was one way that you get your message secretly from one place to the other. And of course, your message is usually carried in writing. You know, it's not until we get to the 19th century, which maybe I'll talk about in a little bit, where we get new methods. So if it's going to be in writing, you have to be wary that you could get caught, that your letter could get captured. So how do you protect yourself in the event that it could get captured? One was the invisible ink. Another method that they used during the American Revolution is something called either the mask letter or the grill letter. And those of you sitting and watching can see an image. If you're listening on the radio, I'll try my best to describe what we're looking at. But basically, you have on the far right here, you see an image of a message written out in a kind of bizarre shape, a code. And then in the middle, what you have is maybe a cardboard cutout, and you have that same shape that your message is written in. And then on the far left, you have an ordinary letter. And so the ordinary letter, you know, dear mom, war's fun, I'm enjoying myself. The person on the receiving end will take the mask or the grill with the template, the cutout, put it over the ordinary letter, and then they see an entirely different message. So it's kind of tricky in that you have to really kind of balance the words and balance the meanings so that if you capture the letter, it does look like this ordinary letter, but when you put the template, the grill on top, you're able to see the ordinary message.
And this, I'm hoping, is a writing assignment in your class that you never are willing to describe to me, because I would love to come into class for that.
I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so there's another method that they used during the American Revolution was to take messages and to make them as teeny tiny as possible so that they could be hidden in other things. So there was one, the quill letter, where they would cut pieces of paper into really thin strips, roll them up into a tiny size, and stick it in the quill of a letter, or excuse me, of a pen, a feather pen. So that was one way you could get messages. Another image that we're looking at here is a little silver ball. It's basically the size of a bullet, and you would take a message, make it very, very tiny, put it inside the ball, and carry that with you. And there's this great anecdote of a British spy who was carrying one of those, and he got caught by the Americans, and knowing that he was holding on to a secret message, he swallowed the ball. The Americans saw him do that, and so they promptly gave him, you know, something to drink that was going to make him vomit up the ball so that they could get the message. So he drank it, vomited up the ball, immediately saw it, grabbed it, and swallowed it again, to which point they offered him the opportunity of either letting them cut it out of his stomach or throwing it up again, which he drank the agent and took that again. So these are just a couple examples of things during the Revolution.
Did they not have laxatives?
There was what, oh. I think they'd rather.
Anne's thinking we could get it out the other way.
That takes a little longer.
It's quite a bit longer.
And did they have magnifying glasses? I'm trying to figure out how, because that
yes,
writing.
They did have magnifying glasses. Okay. That's how they would get it out. Then there is also the question, so if one way to prevent the enemy from reading your message is to put it in invisible ink, to use this grill, but also they began to develop secret code. And so what we're looking at here is a couple different, you know, coding devices and decoding devices. So of course, the writer and the recipient each have versions of whatever coding device you're going to use. So there's these wheels on the far right, which were quite common during the American Civil War, and you would basically replace one letter with another letter. Same with this one. I think it's like this. Here, you follow your dots and your dashes and moving the letters around. But this way, you receive a letter and it just looks like gibberish, but you have to figure out the code.
And then the last items, this is sort of a collection of other tools, and my personal favorite is right in the middle, but so hold that one till the end, please.
Okay, so then I thought I would fast forward to the 20th century. And once we get into the period of kind of professional intelligence agencies, and this, in this case, Anne was spot on that, whereas espionage, spying dates back to the Bible, professional intelligence is quite new. And it's really the late 19th century and into the 20th century that states, nations began to develop agencies to practice intelligence. Well, once you get to sort of the era of World War II forward, a lot of these intelligence agencies have an R&D team, teams of scientists to come up with the craziest, wackiest ways to spy, to gather intelligence that they could think of. So the images that those of us sitting in the room are looking at behind here come from the OSS. That's the American Office of Strategic Services intelligence agency during World War II. And the guy who was in charge of the R&D there, a guy named Stanley Lovell, I believe was his name, really he was, kind of the Rube Goldberg of intelligence tactics. So let me see what we're looking at here. Top left, a deck of playing cards that conceals a map, which would be revealed when the top layer was peeled off. This tiny little camera in the shape of a matchbox. And of course, it doesn't seem so tiny to us in 2018, where we carry cameras. Maybe I have one in my pen, you don't know. But back in 1944, that was a small camera. Similarly, a button on your coat could be a camera. This particular one is a compass. But then one of Lovell's schemes was the idea of taking bats and equipping them with explosive devices so that you would unleash your box of bats in enemy territory. They would, you can't train bats. They're not like carrier pigeons, train them where to go. But presumably they would fly over enemy territory. And then at some point the explosive would go off and death and destruction would come to your enemy. So they did not actually carry out the scheme, but you can read about it. It was one of their great brainiac ideas.
I should point out when Deborah sent this slide to me, there was no caption below the bat. And I had to call her and ask, what's the bat? And she said, well, it's strapped with an explosive, which I found quite intriguing, and that's why it's my favorite one. Lachlan and Anne, do you think of particular equipment? In the case of Northern Ireland, obviously, as you've pointed out, it's very almost brutal. It's very rudimentary. What sort of equipment would we be thinking about there?
Yeah, well, they certainly developed all sorts of sophisticated listening devices, cameras, et cetera. And as time went on, started becoming more and more computerized with computerized databases of license plates, for example. One of the most sort of innovative, along maybe trending towards the Rube Goldberg, was in the early 70s. There was a front company called the Foursquare Laundry. And what that did was go to the Republican areas in Belfast, collect people's laundry at a sort of amazingly cheap rate they were giving to all these people. And so what they were doing, they weren't actually a laundry company. They were there and forensically examining the clothes. Is there gunpowder residue? Is there evidence of Semtex? Are there as many people in the house as there says on the census rolls? And so there were sort of tricks like that that were employed in Northern Ireland as well. That was quickly uncovered by the IRA, and the people involved in it were executed very quickly. But it just gives you an example of the sort of trickery that was often going on, because it's, as we'll get to in a minute, on the people side of it, in Northern Ireland, it would be very hard for outsiders to go into Republican areas and not be instantly flagged as, there were as agents. That there were pretty ham-fisted attempts at the beginning. In the words of one person, a quartermaster's idea of what you wear at a pub, tweed jackets too, ties matching, like, and just sort of ridiculous attempts at first. But where we get into it is the people level, where you start turning people and having double agents.
It's really hard to top a potentially exploding bat. But I think for the stuff that the Soviets used, the most famous example probably, of course, is the bugging, not with actual bugs, to the best of my knowledge, but mechanical ones. The most famous example. In 1945, this beautiful wooden carved seal of the United States was given to the U.S. ambassador in Moscow to put in his residence. And 7 years later, it was discovered that there was a bug implanted in it. They didn't actually. So they discovered it in 1952. It wasn't actually made public until 1960. The Soviets decided to make a big show on the floor of the UN about how the U.S. is spying on them. And at that point, like 4 days into the testimony, the U.S. brought out this wooden carved seal, and we're like, both sides do it, both sides. So that's kind of one of the most famous ones. And of course, this, it's safe to assume that kind of everything in Moscow where foreigners would be residing would be bugged. And this is something that continues to relatively present. There was a discovery in 1999 that the State Department was actually bugged. So I mean, provisions have been made to make sure that that can't happen again, presumably by dismantling the State Department most recently. But until then, other provisions were in place to do that. So this is kind of the bugging has continued to be a strategy by the Soviets.
But we do have to kind of think about the technology, because when you talk about the time period, so in the 1940s, 1950s, putting a bug in a seal like that and managing to actually get information through it, what's the power source getting there, et cetera. That's kind of amazing. What we have on the screen right now is sort of the classic, if you watch a lot of World War II type movies and early Cold War stuff, a suitcase, radio. This is, you can carry it around, looks like your suitcase, but is it really your suitcase? And you go into your room and you hope no one ever picks it up. A little bit later on in the 1960s, 1970s, things like heel transmitters. In this case, a pair of shoes from an ambassador, once again, were borrowed, let's call it. And the heel was refitted with a transmitter, and suddenly you're able to hear what that person is saying. But once again, power source for it. So there's a lot of actual technology involved in this. So we go from the simplicity of that template that gets placed over the letter to things that are much more sophisticated. And then, of course, we start moving into the realm of things that are not just intelligence gathering, but actual action being taken. And here's an example of a weapon that someone would have actually carried. In this case, it's something the KGB used, wrapping it up in newspaper, so it just looks like they're carrying a newspaper. But it's a gas-powered weapon that would actually fire a projectile. And then, of course, rather famously, things like umbrellas, this one from the 1970s used to assassinate people. Are there pieces of equipment that you think are sort of like prototypical, that when people think spy or espionage, this is the thing they should be thinking about, or that they symbolize something in particular? Is there anything at all? For me, the umbrella, because I've watched enough movies where they've been used nefariously, and I carry one myself, just to warn you all. For me, that's one of those sorts of devices. Is there anything that you sort of think that's a spy thing? Anything at all?
I mean, for me, it's the bug. It's the various bugs, but it's interesting that. Well, on the one hand, you have kind of the perfection of some of the earlier models, but you also see this is really an area where a tremendous amount of ingenuity, is deployed. One of my favorite is a weird term in this context. One of my favorite examples was the thumb drive scandal, where I keep wanting to say Soviets, where the Russians wanted to get to NATO computers that were not connected to the internet. And so the solution was they put on the market I believe it was in Afghanistan, a whole bunch of thumb drives in the hopes that at least one of them would be bought by an American, which it was, and plugged into a computer that wasn't connected to the internet, which it was, and that thumb drive became a way to be able to get to that information. So there's really kind of a tremendous amount of this technology. But I think the other interesting thing to kind of to think about as far as this particular area is that our shifting our shifting attitude towards privacy, right, in a way kind of both challenges but also makes the job of spies a lot easier, right? The geolocators, for example, right? There was a recent, again, I want to say scandal, but at this point, you know, what's a scandal, right? So when it was discovered that kind of military deployment was visible through a fitness app, right? So, I mean, so there are all sorts of ways in which we now give up our privacy kind of very casually, and by we, I mean both, you know, regular people who don't necessarily have anything of value to contribute to foreign governments, and people who might. And so that information can be easily accessed. So in a sense, you don't even have to, invent some of this, some of the technology. And the information just seems to be coming, you know, can come to you. You just need to figure out how to process it.
Well, that's back to the issue of this is about intelligence. How do you gather information? And if the information's already out there, it's really more a question of how do you use the information or recognize that it's there to be used.
And filter out the useful and
I'll
the
follow up. I
useless.
mean, one kind of contrast to the idea of open and easily accessible information that we see developing through the history of espionage and intelligence is the coding. So the cryptanalysis. And before we looked at these very kind of rudimentary you know, decoders and the wheels, and even though, you know, I couldn't decode one of those, but this is why I teach history, not math. But as information transfer has developed, the need to encode your information in a more complicated way has developed. So just a couple, you know, kind of steps along the way as technology develops, you get the telegraph invented in the 1840s, right? And so during wartime, during the Civil War, people would send messages back and forth via telegraph. And you, if you were smart, if you were an army, you would code those messages. But people could, you know, they could literally tap into, you know, this idea of wiretapping comes from telegraph wires. You could get the message by tapping into the telegraph wires. You could also get the message by paying somebody off on either end where it's sent and received. Something that really changes the game in terms of sending information back and forth is the invention of radio, much later at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And that's because there's radio waves, they're out in the open, which means anybody can grab that. Now, knowing that anybody can grab your information means you really need to be sure that you manage to hide it, and you develop these really sophisticated codes. Probably the one that most people are familiar with is during World War II, there's the invention of this coding machine called the Enigma machine. And the Enigma machine is actually invented for business purposes in the 1930s, but the Germans use this Enigma machine to code their messages during World War II. And you know, the code changes every 24 hours. So, you know, someone types in something on one end, there's another machine on the other that decrypts it. And famously, you have the British in Bletchley Park that use, you know, Ultra as the secret project that figures out how to decode this Enigma machine. And it's, you know, it's the beginning of computer science is decoding them. So of course, you know, as technology develops, code gets more sophisticated and also decoding gets more sophisticated. And again, when we think about the history of intelligence and intelligence practice and intelligence agencies, instituting an office within your intelligence agency dedicated to cryptanalysis, dedicated to decoding, that only happens around World War I, and it's, you know, in reaction to this radio. So even though there were spies during the American Revolution, even the British, you know, don't have a cryptanalysis office within their naval or military department until World War I, because it's not a thing. And again, now I'm sure we have some of the best minds in the country who are dedicated to figuring out how to unravel coded messages. So yeah, yes, there's a lot of things kind of floating out there in the open, but there's also more sophisticated ways to disguise them.
This really does all come down to people, and Lachlan, you started talking about people earlier in terms of how folks are recruited, sometimes in not very nice ways. But how are spies recruited?
In the case of Northern Ireland, a couple of ways, because Northern Ireland's complicated because from the point of view of the British state, you have two groups, basic groups to infiltrate. You have the Republicans who want to see, you know, a united Ireland, and then you also have loyalists, that is pro-British paramilitaries, who are also targets for infiltration. So you have sort of two different groups, one that's allegedly on your side and that you're often working with in often pretty insidious ways. So in terms of trying to get people from the Republican side of things, from the very beginning, there were sort of mass arrests. The first day of internment in 1971 in Northern Ireland, 342 people are arrested, subjected to sort of what we now would call, well, what the European Court of Human Rights called inhuman and degrading treatment, where people would be hooded. High-value subjects were subject to white noise, extremes of temperatures, the sorts of things we've become sort of familiar with in the so-called War on Terror, right? And so some people would be broken that way. In other cases, you would have people that were from the Loyalist community that would sort of sign up to be double agents within Loyalist paramilitary groups, but working for British intelligence rather than the Loyalist paramilitary groups. So it gets very confusing very quick for everyone involved, and that's one thing that I wanted to sort of emphasize in my comments, is that we often have the, us versus them, the monolithic state versus. That's not at all the case in Northern Ireland. In fact, most of the groups were kind of at odds with one another, that the local groups like Special Branch from the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the local Northern Irish sort of security services, were highly sort of hostile to groups like MI5, who they saw as sort of cowboy interlopers who didn't know the territory, who had no real stakes in it. And so there were often interagency rivalries to the point of actual assassinations among supposedly allied groups, where different people being set up and you never know who's being set up. So in terms of recruitment, it could be from any number of ways, and you don't necessarily know who is who and who's playing for whom necessarily.
Yeah, the amount of distrust. And when you start thinking about the levels of disagreement, the intergroup, intra-group disagreement, the confusion, the distrust would just be unbelievable for those who get deeply into it, I would imagine.
Right.
And how are people recruited?
Probably, for the Soviets, I would say three general approaches. There's the appeal to ideological sympathy, especially, of course, during the Cold War, the idea that you're helping the good cause. Financial incentives. And that doesn't mean that people who did it for ideological reasons weren't well compensated. Right. So these are not the
not mutually exclusive.
The three are not necessarily mutually exclusive. My personal favorite is blackmail, and I think that one is, in some ways, it really resonates with some of the examples that Lachlan provided for Northern Ireland. Both the Soviets and the successors, the Soviet successors. One very important strategy is finding out people's weaknesses, compromising them in some way, and then using that information against them. During the Cold War, one of the particular target areas was trying to find out if anybody was a closeted homosexual, getting them in a compromising position while they were on Soviet soil, and then with the assumption that the revelation would destroy them completely, and therefore using that information against them. I think the nature, a lot of the compromising information is various kinds of sexual activity, usually involving a plan, and then ample documentation. Of course, it can be other, compromising information, but probably the the sexual stuff was the most popular. But it certainly could go hand. It ultimately depends on what you're most afraid of to have revealed about you, and so certainly financial impropriety, money laundering, various things like that could also play a factor. But again, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think the sexual compromise was the easiest one to accomplish, and so I think that was kind of as a sure thing, and then everything else was just kind of a delightful bonus.
Deborah, are we missing any of the major ways
One thing missing.
Yes.
So that was great. There's an acronym that I use when I teach what the motivations are for people to spy, and the acronym is MICE. And Anne hit the first three. So money, ideology, coercion, and then the E from mice is ego. And there have been studies done of spies, particularly during the Cold War, that show, not surprisingly, money is the main motivator for people to choose to spy. I happen to find ideology and ego some of the more interesting. So I do have. This is one group of people that fit in the category that Anne was describing of ideology. And the Cambridge Five is a very kind of well-known ring of British spies who were recruited by the Soviet Union during the 1920s and 1930s. And these, for the most part, 4 of them were university students. There was one professor. But these were people who were kind of turned off by the capitalist lifestyle and the bourgeois life in the West, and believed the promise of communist ideology, and they get recruited, during the 20s and 30s when communism is kind of new and on the rise, and it turns out to be a great payoff for the KGB, the predecessor of the KGB, because these guys then make their way into various government agencies, into the CIA, into MI5 and MI6 and the Foreign Office, and they do really help supplying a lot of information to the Soviet Union from the United States and Great Britain during the Cold War. Kim Philby, one of the famous, these guys get outed in the 1950s, and he says he has no regrets, even though he definitely has blood on his hands. So that's an example of ideology, but I want to tell one quick story about ego. And so what does that mean, the E? This is, the person who just thinks that leading a double life, being, a liar, a sneak, a spy is as cool as it sounds, right? And so there's this great story of a Spanish man during World War II named Juan Pujols Garcia, who has been described by historians as the Walter Mitty spy. And if you know Walter Mitty, he lived this whole fantasy life, and he hated Nazis and hated Germans and Hitlers, and he really wanted to spy for the British, but who is this Spanish guy? They don't have any interest in him. So he actually manages to ingratiate himself into Nazi intelligence and works as a spy, providing information for the Nazis about Great Britain. And so he sends them all these letters, all these notes about what's going on in Britain, what the weather's like, what the attitude's like, what the dreams, the motives, the goals are of people in England, except he's writing this from Spain. And so it's only later on in the war when the British say, look, the British have a really great double-cross system where they're intercepting Nazi agents, and they're saying, the Nazis are getting information from this agent, and we haven't caught him yet. Who is he? And finally they realize it's this guy who's been knocking on the door of the embassy, and so they managed to get him and recruit him. So he's a really great and interesting story, and he does actually prove quite valuable to British intelligence, but he is not doing it for the money. I mean, maybe ideology fits into it. As Anne said, there's a lot of overlap there, but he very much, you can tell somebody who gets a thrill of leading this double life and fooling people.
And I think, the kind of the ego issue, of course, also into this category, you can put people who are potentially duped into providing information, right? Because people who think that they're smarter than everybody else, people who, if you stimulate their vanity, will spill absolutely everything about everything on this, because they want to feel, important, and perhaps more dangerous than some of the other, categories.
One of the other alternative forms of diplomacy, it's actually in the title, so we have to cover it a little bit, would be assassination. This came up recently, obviously, with the attempts on Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Russia has denied doing anything, and just about everybody else has said, no, there's plenty of evidence that says this is you. Do countries take credit for assassinations? Anne?
The denial thing, I just want to say that, Russia has reached a point where on state media, they're basically saying, we totally didn't do it, but if we did it, wouldn't that be cool? So denial is kind of a very strong, right? We didn't, right? But if we did, what a cool, what an amazing thing it would have been if we only did it. So kind of denial is a strong word for their position on
not
the
fully
subject.
Acknowledging.
Right.
How's that?
Well, and they filed a complaint with the Russian embassy in the UK filed a complaint that now that the that the Skripals actually are doing better, that the Russian embassy representative is not allowed to visit them in the hospital, like a formal complaint that, you know, as Russian citizens, they should be able to have access to them to see how they're doing, because somebody's clearly out to get them, and so they need to really check on them as much as possible. But more seriously about kind of the question of admitting, I mean, in some ways, it goes to how kind of the audience that you have. And I think the public statements to the West versus the statements within Russia kind of signify that there are different goals here, right? For internally, you want to be able to show off to your people how clever their government is, how much better their government is than everybody else. So there's a kind of, to the loyalists, right, to shore up their enthusiasm that we're doing great. And especially right now when Russia's international standing is somewhat precarious, to be able to demonstrate that Russia is still a superpower is very important. But it's also kind of important without officially acknowledging, which could potentially lead to international more international sanctions. There's also the sense that it's a show of force, right? A show of force to anybody who may be thinking about disagreeing with the government, may be thinking about defecting, may be thinking of doing whatever. They will get you. They can get you anywhere, and nobody can do anything about it. And I think so in that sense, the public, a certain amount of public acknowledgement, or at least kind of the allowing the implication to stand, is part of this strategy, right? You only have to hurt one person, but it potentially affects so many other people as far kind of in curbing dissent, criticism, spying, you know, whatever you're trying to curb.
Lachlan, would you say were there attempts to take credit, or, as Anne has put it, almost take credit?
Yeah, I think there, again, because of the complex nature of this, there were all sorts of opportunities for assassination to be used. And in fact, there were in Northern Irish parlance, to give someone the message was meant to kill them. And so that idea of assassination as a sort of message delivery system is very much a part of every aspect of it, from you know, the targeting of their own sort of disloyal or no longer useful agents, to people that they saw as threats, whether they be sort of military, as Jerry Adams was considered, or even sort of someone like famously sort of broke one of these moments of the sort of visible nature of collusion between paramilitaries and the state, was a human rights solicitor called Pat Finucane in Northern Ireland, who was assassinated. The person who ordered the assassination was an agent of British intelligence. And so the idea was that this guy was getting too good at his job. He was getting too many people off and was seen as that much of a threat that they would you know, get rid of him as kind of a message to everyone else, is how many would view it. In the subsequent sort of investigations, there were several, the Stevens reports, some things that seemed to come out was that when things like this come known, there might be ulterior motives for this to be happening in the first place. For example, you have to look at who benefits from the revelation of this. One of the things that happens from the investigation of the collusion between various intelligence groups and loyalist paramilitaries is that MI5 gets to consolidate power over formerly kind of semi-independent groups. And so a lot of intelligence analysts would say that, well, is there something else, big picture, going on beyond just the revelation of these sort of assassination ploys here? And so who benefits, who doesn't benefit is often, depends on who you ask, right?
Well, and I maybe should have started, what is the goal of the assassination?
Right.
I guess maybe I should have started there. Are there unifying goals? Are there a limited number of goals that are usually found?
Well, I'll say, I mean, in terms of purpose, and if I look at intelligence as assassinations as carried out by intelligence agencies, since I'm the espionage person here, you know, if it's an alternative form of diplomacy, the goals are either you're trying to avoid overt war, so or not seem like you're weak and not accomplishing your own goal. So it really is a gray area. It really is the alternative form. So, you know, an example that came to mind when I was thinking about this is the CIA's attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. And you know, Castro, he's this communist dictator literally in the United States backyard, and he is just, you know, a thorn in their side, and the United States can't stand him, but they don't want to actually go to war with him. But they also don't want to just let him sit there and boisterously insult capitalism and insult the United States. So they go with this alternative means, the middle area of trying to assassinate him. Now, you know, the irony, they basically fail over and over and over again. They fail to overthrow him famously during the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And then there's a claim made by one of Castro's bodyguards that the CIA tried to assassinate him 638 times. And I wrote down some of the great assassination attempts, included poisoning him with botulism toxin, cigars, giving him a diving suit that was prepared that would be infected with a fungus that would cause this chronic and debilitating skin disease. A booby-trapped conch placed at the bottom of the sea, an exploding cigar. You know, that's almost like the exploding bats, but he always had other things that weren't assassination, but they were going to slip him these thallium salts to destroy his beard because that's his sign of, you know, manliness and power. So if his hair falls out, lo and behold. Another one, lace his radio studio with LSD so that he sounds crazy when he's there. So, you know, all these attempts, 638 probably is certainly an exaggeration. But in the 1970s, when the Church Committee reviews a lot of the kind of way, you know, the practices of the CIA that they've been carrying out during the 50s and 60s, they did substantiate, I think, at least 8 assassination attempts on Castro. And so there's this image that I pulled up that just makes me laugh all the time of Castro holding up this newspaper about a plot to kill him and laughing. And he, you know, he famously says in regards to all these attempts on his life that he believed, quote, if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal. So the fact that this gets revealed and that's out there, not only does it not help the United States advance their cause of getting rid of this communist leader, but it gives Castro more power, more legitimacy, more authority in the eyes of his people, and it makes the Americans look bad that they can't even get rid of this one guy.
Anne?
Well, and this is a great illustration of the problems of democracy. You know, if the Soviet Union wanted to assassinate someone and they weren't successful, nobody would have to know about it, right? And so this is kind of this is what allows, I think, strategies. I mean, I know I was perhaps too blasé, especially followed by Lachlan's example of kind of the really horrible strategies used for spying. Saying, while spying, you know, it is what it is. But I think once we move to assassinations, I think this is where the situation really changes dramatically. And so when you have a closed regime, a repressive regime, it makes it that much easier for them to deploy assassination. But it also makes it easier for them to control the impact, right? So you have the elimination of a particular person, you have the terror that it inspires in others who might follow suit. You have the demonstration of power. Again, especially I mean, during the Cold War, it wasn't quite as important. I think now. It's much more important for Russia to be able to show that it's still a major player. So these kinds of things, without the subsequent revelations about things that went wrong, this is what allows the assassinations to have the extra power as an alternative form of diplomacy, because there's really almost no. It's a win-win for for a regime that doesn't have to worry about disclosures as far as deploying this as a strategy.
We certainly are much more aware of these things today than we had been, and there are a number of posters for us to look at that are basically propaganda or getting the public involved, and you found a number of these. The first one we're looking at, could you describe this?
This is an American one. So this is a kind of a genre in World War I, World War II, and a little bit during the Cold War, at least on the Soviet side, kind of the don't talk, right? Loose lips, sink ships and so on. So this is an American one, right? Kind of the assumption that the enemy might be watching, and so vigilance is necessary. Sorry, the Soviet one, kind of the be vigilant, and in the upper right-hand corner. It says, you have to be vigilant because, everything you say, rumors and gossip. There's a short distance between rumors and gossip to treason. So this is kind of with the invention of, with the telephone becoming more prominent, people who blather on the phone are assistants to the fascist spies. And this is kind of, again, this keeps going, right? Don't talk on the phone. You will be a great find for a spy. This is now we're moving into the Cold War, right? Kind of the duality. The seemingly normal person that you're telling gossip to is really an enemy, and you can see that he's the enemy because he has a monocle, which is kind of a visual, which is a visual cue that this person is, that this person is the enemy. And this is now 1961, right? Again, kind of the enemy is watching, and so you have to be vigilant. This is one of my favorites. I think the British ones are the cutest, if I can say that about propaganda. But there's a lot of them. Kind of the careless talk costs lives, and there's one with a bus where Hitler is sitting behind you while you were talking, and here, of course, the walls have ears, and you can see that the ears. Hopefully, if you look closely, right, you can see that they're little Hitler faces, right? Those are the ears, that are potentially watching. And this is the way in which you can see that while the actual spying should be left to professionals, there's a way of just like part of when we talk about total war of the 20th century is in governments ensuring that everybody's involved in some capacity, even with spying. Even if you don't have the skill set to do the actual spy, you can still do your part by preventing the other side from potentially getting information.
And these posters actually are very interesting to look at. Some of them are done quite nicely. You have to look kind of hard to see some things and not so hard to see some other things. But we are much more aware of this than ever before, and there is a whole genre of literature now, in part maybe because we're aware of things. What's the appeal of the literature, do you think?
Well, first of all, I would say that now spy literature is not new. I think it dates back to at least before World War I. But the appeal of spy literature, I think, first of all, just kind of who doesn't love murder and intrigue and scandal? That's one thing. But I think it's appealing in that if it's written well, it very much reflects the anxieties, the reality as of the time. And this is why, historians, we actually love studying literature, because I can go back, for example, to look at British spy literature of the late 19th century, and I can see what it was that the population was preoccupied. And in this case, the spy literature pre-World War I actually fuels the development of counter-espionage agencies. You have these authors saying, why look, there's spies everywhere, and you should write in and tell me about the spies you see. And they receive all these letters, and it happens to be one of these novelists that's friends with a guy who works at the fledgling MI5, and they do set up this counter-espionage agency. So yeah, I think the appeal is very much, it reflects what we're thinking. Everybody likes books that kind of make you think and make you feel, oh, it's just like me.
Lachlan?
Yeah, and I would agree completely with all of that. And then in terms of the sort of fictitious examples of it, what side of your reptilian brain doesn't sort of secretly like the James Bond coolness and License to Kill on the fictional side. But of course, as I've hopefully emphasized, that bears very little to the reality of the situation. But there is that sort of allure to it, right? That's been there for so long.
During the Soviet period, kind of the Soviet regime had a difficult relationship with spy literature, because anything that smacked too much of kind of the concern was that it would be too escapist, right? And so kind of and it would be too popular. Anything that's too popular becomes problematic. But at the same time, certain kinds of spy literature could be educational, right? And so there are a couple of there aren't a lot of really kind of classics, but there are a couple usually dealing with spies. Kind of a very famous one that was made into a movie, where the spy was somebody who was embedded in the upper echelons of the Nazi state, and so kind of he is living there while World War II is going on. The spy literature now is kind of, I would say that there are some that are truly literature, and then there's a lot of pulp literature that really kind of appeals to, again, the lowest common denominator, usually the evil Americans, right, doing awful things and being vanquished in various ways and defeated because, of course, they're all stupid, and their Russian counterparts, are not.
Well, I'm going to open the floor up to questions, but while I'm walking out to hand the mic to somebody, any particular author, fact or fiction that you would suggest people take a look at?
I'll tell you one of my favorites. I mean, I actually don't read very much spy literature, probably because I'm reading the histories of it too much. But Graham Greene, who did work for British intelligence, I think in the 50s maybe. One of my favorites by him is called Our Man in Havana. And I like that one. It's actually a satire of spy literature. And the story kind of follows a guy that almost is similar to this Agent Garbo, Pujols Garcia, that I was talking about, who he's actually a vacuum salesman, but he needs some extra money, and so he sends back all these detailed diagrams and just makes up all these stories about the spies in his circle back to London from Cuba. And they keep paying him and financing him. So that's a good one for you to check out.
Anyone else?
He's a contemporary Russian writer. His name is Boris Akunin, Akunin, and he is writing about pre-World War I Russian spies. But this is sort of, he is the thinking person's spy literature, right? This is not the pulp that commoners read, right? This is, so I mean, it's very interesting, kind of perhaps more as a reflection of contemporary Russia than than anything else. But and it's of course a series of books.
Yeah, two quick authors. One on the nonfiction end of things, Martin Dillon I can't recommend highly enough for Northern Irish stuff. He has a couple of books, The Dirty War and The Triggermen, both of which get into much more detail of the things I touched on today. And then on the fiction side, Owen McNamee has a couple of awesome books out there of historical fiction. The Ultras, which centers on a real-life person, Robert Nyrak, who was disappeared in Northern Ireland, and then Resurrection Men, which is a sort of fictionalization of the actual paramilitary group, the Shankill Butchers. And as odd as it might seem, he actually treats the subject with poetic language, as odd as that seems, but as good a sort of fictional, historical fiction of the topic as you can get, I think.
Questions? Do you have a couple questions?
With the state, with our country being in, and really the state of the world, how do you think things like Alexa and Siri are gonna maybe be part of that? How do we go from not talking about things to anyone to asking these things that pretty much anybody can have access to?
In some ways, I think the problem for intelligence agencies these days is now a glut of information. So, yes, it is terrifying that we carry around these little devices where we can be tracked everywhere. We write a million emails spilling, where we are, what we're going, what we're thinking. So yes, it is terrifying that our thoughts, no matter what, the electronic device we're speaking into or writing into, makes us trackable. But I think it's a huge challenge for intelligence in that, it's now a needle in the haystack. In intelligence parlance, you have signals and noise, and it's just how do you get anything out of it? And I think this is a problem. How do you find real terrorists or real criminals when you're reading about someone like me talking about espionage, but just for an academic purpose?
I'll do something different, and I'll be optimistic. I'm going to say things like Alexa and Siri, maybe it's actually part of a plot to prevent other governments from being innovative, right? Because they think, oh, look, you don't have to innovate and come up with new strategies of decrypting information. It's all right here. And so as a result, it can contribute to the decline in the innovative technology that is deployed against America.
One more question.
I'm interested if you have any thoughts about, I guess what I'm thinking of it as is third-party roles in espionage. So maybe that, there's this, the major conflict are between two big actors. But I imagine with the information out there that, a country or even an individual may come across something that's really potent information. And I wondered does that happen? Is that a thing, or maybe not?
Almost stumbling onto the big find. Deborah, you think of an example where somebody who was not involved directly happened to find the big piece of data that was useful?
I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is, and I'm not sure if it's even third party, is the Zimmermann telegram, which was a letter written from Germany to the United States. And it happened to be the British who were intercepting German lines looking for something totally different that found this offer proffered by the British government to Mexico the German government during World War I to Mexico, saying if you join World War I on the side of Germany, we'll help you get Texas back. And when the British find this, and it's actually a big scandal because the British cannot tell the Americans that they have this document, because the way they got it was basically tapping into the American embassy, which Britain and the United States were allies, so they aren't supposed to admit that they've been bugging, wiretapping, whatever it may be, into the American embassy. So they do inadvertently come across this, amazing document, and America is neutral at this point, right? This is while America isn't in the war. So the British know this is a huge find, and they know they want to let the Americans know that they've found this valuable piece of information, and they have to go back through back channels and get somebody in Mexico City to go buy the telegram from the Western Union office and say, this is how we got it, rather than we found it through wiretapping the embassy in Washington. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you had in mind, but that was a big inadvertent find during World War I.
Well, if you would please give our panelists a round of applause. That's Lachlan Whalen from the Department of English and Linguistics, also the Director of International Studies, and Liv Shiz and Deborah Bauer from the Department of History. Thank you very much. This was brought to you by, of course, the folks in the library who let us use their space, College Television. Thank you to WBOI and to all of you for coming. So why don't you give them a round of applause for sitting here.